Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. When you walk today into the soaring Gothic Cathedral of Chartres, the southwest of Paris, your eyes are drawn upward toward the ribbed vaults, the tracery of stained glass, the rose windows that shimmer in shifting tones of blue and crimson. But the true story of this cathedral, like so many medieval churches, does not begin with what lies above the eye. It begins below, in the shadowed crypt, a place of stone and silence, where the foundations of belief and the weight of centuries were pressed into the earth itself. It is easy to forget that long before Chartres Cathedral rose as the embodiment of Gothic architecture, the site was already ancient ground. The hill where the cathedral now stands had, according to tradition, been considered sacred even before Christianity. Roman sources speak of a grove dedicated to a mother goddess, perhaps linked to fertility cults of the Gauls. When Christianity spread through late Roman Gaul, such pagan spaces were not erased, but rather absorbed, layered over with new meaning. A church was raised, modest at first, then replaced, and replaced again as fire and rebuilding marked the centuries. By the time the Gothic cathedral took shape in the 12th and 13th centuries, there had already been at least 5 previous churches upon the same ground. Each left its trace beneath the floors, and in those traces lie the real, boring, and yet essential history. The crypt of Chartres is among the largest in Europe. It is not an accident of design, but the result of centuries of rebuilding. Fires consumed earlier churches in 743 and 858, and most disastrously in 1194, the Great Fire of 1194. Often recounted with drama, burned nearly everything above ground. But in a quiet twist of fate, the crypt survived. Its long tunnels, built from Romanesque stonework, endured where timber roofs and delicate sculpture could not. This survival created a curious paradox. The heart of Chartres is not Gothic light, but Romanesque shadow. The pilgrims who descended there, carrying their candles and murmured prayers, countered a world of damp stone walls, faintly carved capitals, and low vaults. What exactly was beneath the floor? First, there were chapels small, tucked into the darkness, where relics of saints were kept. Chartres was renowned for one relic above all, the Sancta Camicia, said to be the tunic worn by the Virgin Mary when she gave birth to Christ. The relic itself, a cloth folded and enclosed in reliquary boxes, was believed to have miraculous powers. Pilgrims journeyed hundreds of miles to venerate it. Yet, curiously, its guardians often kept it below the cathedral, in the crypt, accessible through winding corridors. Here, not in the dazzling nave, faith was enacted most directly through touch, through sight of a reliquary gleaming in dim light, through whispered prayers beside the stone. But relics were not the only things buried beneath Chartres. Human remains were there as well, bones of saints, of bishops, of wealthy patrons who secured burial near holy ground. Medieval burial customs often distinguished sharply between laity and clergy, rich and poor. Ordinary townsfolk of Chartres were laid in cemeteries beyond the walls. But for those of status, the cathedral floor itself became the boundary between earth and eternity. Beneath the paving stones, within the crypt chapels, coffins of carved wood or stone sarcophagi rested. Many of these burials have since been disturbed, their identities blurred. Excavations in the 20th century revealed bones jumbled in niches, reminders of how time reduces all to fragments. It is tempting to think of the crypt as merely a functional space, a basement, a foundation. Yet, in the medieval imagination, it was more than that. Crypt was the symbolic womb of the cathedral, just as Christ was said to have been entombed and then risen. So too, the church itself was thought to emerge from its dark undercroft into the light of the nave. To walk downward into the crypt was to enter a symbolic underworld. To emerge again was to enact resurrection. This symbolism was not abstract. Pilgrims were guided deliberately through the crypt along routes that brought them past shrines and chapels before they ascended into the main church. Their bodily movement mirrored spiritual transformation. One of the most curious features beneath Shtura is the so-called Well of the Strong. This ancient well, cut deep into the limestone, predates the Gothic church by centuries. Local tradition held that Druids once cast offerings into its depths, though evidence for this is elusive. What is certain is that the well continued to fascinate medieval worshippers. It was incorporated into the crypt itself, a reminder of continuity between pre-Christian past and Christian present. To peer into its shaft was to gaze not only into geological time, but also into layers of cultural memory. What was dropped into that darkness, coins, bones, or simply the imaginings of pilgrims who saw in its depth a link to mysteries older than the cathedral itself. The construction of the crypt, too, was an act of quiet resilience. Each rebuilding required masons to salvage, to adapt, to reinforce. Romanesque arches buttressed newer vaults. Old chapels were expanded, walls thickened. These were not glamorous tasks. They demanded patience, technical skill, and endurance, often carried out in damp, airless chambers with flickering torches as the only light. To carve capitals in such conditions was monotonous, yet the result was a space that endured where flames raged. Daily life in the crypt would have been unremarkable most days. Candle smoke coated the stones, wax dripped onto the floors. The air carried the mingled scent of incense and mildew. Monks assigned to guard relics spent long hours in silence, hearing only the shuffle of pilgrims' feet or the distant toll of bells above. Sometimes parishioners sought burial rites there. Sometimes wealthy patrons visited to see their chosen chapels. Most of the time, it was quiet, hidden labor, the forgotten work that sustains a great monument. If you think of Chartres only in terms of soaring vaults in sunlight, you miss this underlayer. Beneath the floor was a world where bones, wells, relics, and stone intersected. A place where the living and the dead were held close together. A place where the past was not erased, but pressed down into the foundations. Where even pagan echoes were not destroyed, but woven into the Christian present. And so, the question remains, what does it mean that the most enduring part of Chartres Cathedral is not its windows or its towers, but its crypt? What truths are hidden when history invites us to look up rather than down? Asterisk, when you last followed the story of Chartres Cathedral, the walls of its magnificent Gothic body were only beginning to rise. We had walked among the foundations, peering into the cool gloom of its crypt, where ancient stones carried older voices, ended with the question of how much of Chartres' weight rested not on the soaring spires and stained glass, but on the forgotten bones and shadows beneath. Now, let us step deeper into that underground, tracing its layers, not as decoration, but as endurance. The crypt of Chartres is not a single room, but a winding system of corridors, half circles, and side chapels buried into the hill. It stretches nearly 230 meters in total length, one of the largest in all of Europe. To a medieval pilgrim, passing down through its arched stone tunnels was to journey backward in time. Before the highlight of the nave and its kaleidoscope windows, one moved through this half-light of silence. Candles guttered, the air smelled of wax and earth, and the steps echoed strangely, as though absorbed by centuries. But this underground was not built all at once. It represents layer upon layer of earlier sanctuaries. The oldest part of Chartres, crypt, predates the Gothic cathedral by centuries, belonging to the Carolingian church of the 9th century. In fact, when fire destroyed the above-ground structure, in 1020, the crypt still held firm, as if shrugging off disaster. When the cathedral was rebuilt, the crypt was simply reused, its tunnels expanded, and its chapels re-sanctified. The 12th century masons who laid out the current Gothic structure had to reckon with what already lay below, shaping their plans not in a pure, blank space, but over these enduring bones of stone. Imagine the challenge to raise what would become the highest and widest Gothic cathedral in France, not on open bedrock, but on a site already riddled with sacred hollows. Engineers had to calculate the weight of towers and vaults while respecting chapels built generations earlier. Rather than demolish, they absorbed the crypt into the plan. In this way, the underground shaped the upper church just as surely as any architect's blueprint for pilgrims. However, the crypt was not a mathematical problem, but a spiritual beginning. They entered from the west, long before approaching the main altar. They shuffled through corridors lined with rough masonry, their hands brushing walls blackened by centuries of candle smoke. Some were peasants seeking healing. Others, nobles, traveling with entourages, wanted to kneel before relics in hidden chapels. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Chartres was not only a local church, but one of the greatest pilgrimage centers of France. And much of that devotion began not in the soaring nave, but beneath the floor in darkness. At the heart of this devotion lay relics. Chief among them was the Sancta Camicia, the holy tunic said to have been worn by the Virgin Mary at Christ's birth. Presented to Chartres around the year 876 by King Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, it immediately became the cathedral's treasure. When fire swept through the upper church in 1194, the tunic was carried safely into the crypt, preserved from the flames. To medieval eyes, its survival was proof of divine protection, a sign that Chartres should rise again. Grander than before, the relic was housed in a small underground chapel where pilgrims could approach it closely. Many came to crawl on their knees along the stone passages to reach it. They brought offerings, wax, coins, or strips of cloth to brush against the tunic and carry away as secondary relics. Imagine the press of bodies in that narrow space, the flicker of lamps across their anxious faces, the murmured Latin prayers, in the mix of exhaustion and awe as they finally reached the reliquary. But the crypt was not only a vessel for Christian relics. Deeper beneath, or perhaps folded into its very shape, were memories that did not belong wholly to Christianity. Before the cathedral, before even the Carolingian church, the hill of Chartres had been sacred ground. Roman sources hint at a pagan sanctuary here, perhaps dedicated to a local Gallic goddess of fertility. Some traditions claim that a spring once flowed on the site, revered by Druids long before Christendom. Whether these stories are legend or faint memory, their echo lingers in the very feel of the underground. Scholars note that the crypt's rounded caps, chapels, and curved corridors almost resemble ancient earthworks or shrines. The act of descending into them is less about vertical weight than about ritual descent. Pilgrims moving through this labyrinth did not just walk into history, they entered layers of belief. Beneath the Virgin's tunic may have lain the whisper of older offerings, two nameless deities of field and stream. The Christian crypt overwrote these foundations, but never fully erased them. Like a palimpsest, stones carried all layers at once. That is, perhaps, why Chartres Underground feels so heavy, even though it is spacious. The corridors are wide enough to carry processions, their barrel vaults supported by thick piers. Yet, even today, when electric lights soften their gloom, there is a pressure in the air, a sense of breath held across centuries. Medieval pilgrims felt it too, though they lacked modern words to describe it. To them, the crypt was a place where heaven touched earth, and where the Virgin's presence mingled with the soil itself. Consider the rituals that unfolded here. On feast days, clergy would process through the crypt carrying relics, chanting psalms that echoed off the curved walls. They would climb from this subterranean passage into the bright nave above, a symbolic rising from darkness to light. At Easter, newly baptized Christians were sometimes led through the crypt as a sign of their burial and rebirth. For them, it was not simply architecture, but theology in stone. Meanwhile, masons and workmen in the 12th century used the crypt as practical shelter. As the Gothic cathedral rose above, the underground remained a stable place to store tools, supplies, and even to rest. One can imagine stonecutters descending into the cool dark after long hours in the sun, laying down chisels beside ancient chapels, and perhaps offering a candle at the Virgin's shrine before sleep. The crypt thus tied together sacred and mundane, past and present, prayer and labor. Yet for all its solidity, the crypt was vulnerable too. Fires did not reach it, but floods sometimes did. Groundwater seeped into the passages, staining their walls with mineral streaks. Candles left soot that blackened vaults. Pilgrims' hands wore grooves into certain stones. The crypt was not a pristine museum, it was a living, breathing environment, scarred by use. That word is what makes it enduring, the passage of thousands, shaping it into something more than design. Chartres Crypt also linked the cathedral to its town. Merchants set up stalls near its entrances, selling candles, badges, and tokens. Pilgrims emerging from the underground often carried small leaden medallions stamped with the Virgin's image, proof of their journey. These tokens traveled far across Europe, spreading Chartres fame even to those who never visited. Thus, what lay beneath the cathedral's floor radiated outward, carried in pockets and purses, embedding Chartres in the wider economy of devotion. As the Gothic cathedral neared completion in the early 13th century, the crypt remained central, but its relationship with the nave above grew more complex. The soaring windows and pointed arches spoke of upward vision, of light piercing shadow. Yet all of this wonder still depended on the unseen labyrinth below. The pilgrims who gazed at Chartres' famed stained glass sometimes forgot that those very windows were funded by offerings made in the crypt, where shadows pressed close to it. It's here that the paradox of Chartres emerges. The cathedral could not have existed without its underground, yet the underground remained hidden. Visitors admired towers and rose windows, not the damp stone beneath. The crypt became, in effect, a foundation of memory as well as masonry. Its role was to remain forgotten, even as it sustained the whole. Today, guides lead visitors through its passages, pointing out Romanesque arches, carved capitals, and the chapel of St. Lubin. Yet, even in this curated form, the crypt still hums with questions. Who walked here in the 9th century, leaving scratches in the stone? What was prayed for at those tiny altars, lit only by a flickering lamp? And how much of the awe people feel above in the nave depends on the silence they first breathed below. This is the tension of Chartres Crypt, visible yet invisible, sacred yet mundane, remembered yet forgotten. Its stones have absorbed centuries of devotion and silence alike. And when one stands in its curved corridors, one cannot help but wonder if so much is hidden beneath the cathedral's floor. What else might lie deeper still, under layers of earth, never yet disturbed? The visitor who had descended into the crypt of Chartres in the 12th century would have been met with silence. Silence that was not merely the absence of sound, but a kind of presence in itself, thick and steady, pressing against the ears, as though the earth itself were breathing slowly. The further one went, the more the faint glow of daylight disappeared, swallowed by the masonry, placed only by the flicker of candles carried carefully in iron holders. The canons of the cathedral knew the passages well. They knew which walls curved toward the absidal east, which stone pillars concealed recesses filled with bones, in which stairwells descended to chambers older than the cathedral itself. For this was the layered nature of Chartres. Above, the lofty Gothic architecture stretching toward heaven, radiant with stained glass and light. Below, a labyrinth of crypts, corridors, and sealed chambers rooted firmly in the soil of earlier centuries. Much of what we know about Chartres crypt comes from a patient kind of archaeology records copied by scribes. It's fragments of inscriptions and careful excavations centuries later. The longest crypt in France stretches beneath the cathedral, a winding corridor more than 250 meters in length. It is said to follow the lines of earlier sanctuaries. The Carolingian church of the 9th century itself built on even older Gallo-Roman foundations. Beneath the stones, the past piled itself quietly, century after century, forming not merely a building, but a palimpsest of devotion. One chamber in particular drew the most reverence, the Sancta Commissio Chapel. According to tradition, this crypt housed the tunic of the Virgin Mary, relic given by Charles the Bald in the 9th century. The garment was said to have been worn by Mary at the time of Christ's birth. For pilgrims, this relic was not a symbol but a material connection to the holy. To see it, or even to be in its presence, was to feel the nearness of the sacred. Yet, the reliquary itself was often hidden, veiled, locked away in metal-bound chests, revealed only on particular feast days. Most visitors would not see the garment at all, only the stone floor beneath which they believed it lay. Here, beneath the soaring architecture above, ordinary pilgrims knelt and whispered prayers. Their journey may have taken weeks or months, across muddy tracks, through forests and plague-stricken villages. But at last, they stood in the dim light of the crypt, pressing hands against stone. The stories written in pilgrim diaries rarely spoke of spectacle. Instead, they described the ordinariness of the place, the chill of the stones, the smell of wax and dampness, the long wait in line. Faith, they remind us, often survives in the unremarkable details. For the clergy, the crypt had another function. It was the cathedral's memory vault. In recesses cut into walls, boxes containing charters, property deeds, and inventories of relics were stored. On wax tablets, records of rents owed by peasants, market tolls, and donations made by nobles were carefully noted and then transferred to parchment. These were the dry, practical necessities that sustained a cathedral's power. Without them, the building above could not have been maintained. What pilgrims saw as holy space, the canons often treated as an archive both sacred and administrative. A reminder that even the most exalted structures depend on paperwork and account keeping beneath Chartres. There were also whispers of older traditions. The crypt's circular chapel, sometimes called St. Lubin's, was built on what may once have been a Gallo-Roman well. In the Middle Ages, the well was remembered as a druid's well, a remnant of pagan worship. Some chroniclers claimed that human sacrifices had been offered there before Christianity sanctified the site. Whether these tales were true or exaggerated, they served an important function. They allowed medieval Christians to see their cathedral not merely as new, but as triumphant, a structure that had erased old gods and planted itself firmly above them. The interplay between the crypt and the cathedral above was constant. When fire swept through Chartres in 1194, destroying much of the church, the crypt beneath was spared. Pilgrims and townspeople saw this as a miracle. The Virgin's relic, kept safe in the subterranean chapel, had survived the flames. In response, they rebuilt the cathedral larger and grander than before, leaving the crypt intact as a foundation. Thus, the old was preserved, wrapped in layers of the new dot. To walk the crypt after the fire would have been to sense that mixture of ruin and survival. Above, charred beams and collapsed roofs still smoldered. Below, Stone walls stood cool and untouched. The contrast must have struck pilgrims deeply, reminding them that while earthly things burned, the foundations of faith endured. Even centuries later, guides would point to their survival as proof of divine protection. But the crypt was not only a place of triumph, it was also a place of unease. Sealed doors and blocked staircases whispered of forgotten chambers. What lay behind them? Some said the bishops of Chartres had ordered certain rooms closed forever, their contents too disturbing or too sacred to reveal. Others imagined hidden relics, perhaps too fragile or politically sensitive to display. The truth was likely more mundane: collapsed corridors, storage spaces filled with rubble, or simply walls built for structural reinforcement. Yet, the mystery endured, and with it, a sense of layered time. Today, when archaeologists explore beneath Chartres, they find traces of all these epochs: Roman masonry reused in medieval walls, fragments of early Christian burials, empty niches where relics once rested, inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of fingers tracing the carved letters. Each is unremarkable on its own, but together they form a kind of hidden chronicle, the slow accumulation of ordinary acts of devotion, administration, and construction. And so the crypt becomes a reminder of what history often hides in plain sight. Beneath the brilliance of Gothic light, there lies the dull persistence of stone corridors. Beneath the soaring rhetoric of sermons, there lies the paperwork of rents and deeds. Beneath the fiery tales of miracles, there lies the steady survival of ordinary masonry. The forgotten crypt of Chartres is not forgotten at all. It is the quiet foundation of everything that rose above it. Yet, questions remain. What, for instance, did those sealed chambers once hold? Were their relics deliberately hidden, waiting to be rediscovered? Or were they simply filled with rubble and sealed to strengthen walls? Could some fragment of the cathedral's earliest history still lie locked away, unknown to both pilgrim and scholar? The silence of the crypt does not answer. It only deepens the mystery, reminding us that beneath every cathedral's floor lies not one history, but many, piled together, waiting in darkness. Asterisk, beneath the soaring arches of Canterbury Cathedral, one of England's most venerated medieval sites, there lies a world that is rarely seen and even less often spoken about. You may know Canterbury as the place where pilgrims flocked during the Middle Ages, inspired by the martyrdom of Thomas Becket in 1170. His shrine, once glittering with jewels and gold, drew kings, queens, canes, and peasants alike, turning the city into one of the most visited places in all of medieval Europe. Yet, beneath the polished marble and gilded reliquaries, under the stones that echo with centuries of choral song, rest the quiet remains of those who are not saints, but ordinary men and women. Their bones, tucked beneath the cathedral floors, tell a story less celebrated, though no less vital to the history of the building itself. When you step into Canterbury Cathedral today, you enter a space of height and light. The Gothic vaults soar above you, each rib carefully carved and balanced, a feat of medieval engineering. The stained glass windows, some of which date back to the 12th century, filter daylight into hues of sapphire and ruby. The nave stretches forward like a great stone river, leading your eyes to the choir and the site where Becket's shrine once stood before it was destroyed under Henry VIII. Pilgrims once filled this vast space, murmuring prayers, whispering confessions, leaving coins at the altar. But if the floor could speak, it would tell of other pilgrims, those who never left Canterbury. Its bones became part of the cathedral itself. The medieval practice of burying the dead within cathedrals was not unusual. For the wealthy or the influential, burial within sacred walls was considered an immense honor, a promise of eternal rest close to the relics of saints. In Canterbury, as in many great churches of Europe, the practice spanned centuries. Bishops, were laid beneath intricate tombs, their effigies carved in alabaster, hands folded in prayer. Knights were entombed in armor, their crossed legs often misinterpreted as signs of crusader service. Wealthy patrons, eager to secure their place near the shrine of Becket, gave large sums of money to the cathedral in exchange for burial rites. To rest near a martyr was to lie in sanctified soil, and proximity to holiness was thought to ease the soul's path to heaven. Yet not all burials were marked with pomp or chiseled stone. Archaeological surveys and limited excavations beneath Canterbury have revealed the silent presence of countless unmarked burials. Ordinary townsfolk who, through one way or another, were interred in spaces that would later be paved over, forgotten, and left beneath the feet of worshippers. Some of these burials date back to the Saxon church that preceded the great Gothic cathedral. Others are from the medieval centuries when Canterbury's influence was at its height. What makes these burials fascinating is not their grandeur, but their ordinariness. Unlike the polished tombs of archbishops, these skeletons lay with few, if any, grave goods. Their bones, worn and weathered, bear witness to lives of labor and hardship. Some skulls show signs of disease, others carry healed fractures, evidence of injuries endured long before death. Many of the skeletons reveal the slow grind of medieval existence, arthritis in the joints, worn teeth from coarse bread and stone ground flour, and ribs marked by the stress of hard physical labor. These are not the stories of kings or saints, but of the men and women who built Canterbury's walls, who tilled the soil around the city, who filled the market stalls, and who prayed in the cathedral they could never have imagined would last nearly 1,000 years. The decision to bury so many within the cathedral also reflects the medieval mindset toward death. The church was not just a place of worship, it was a gateway to eternity. To lie beneath its stones was to be enfolded in sanctity, in an age when purgatory loomed large in the medieval imagination, when masses for the dead were thought to ease suffering in the afterlife. The cathedral floor became more than a surface of stone. It was a threshold between the living and the dead. Every step taken across those slabs was quite literally a walk over the bodies of generations past. Canterbury's clergy were not always comfortable with this abundance of burials. Records suggest periodic concerns about overcrowding, sanitation, and the sanctity of the space itself. By the later Middle Ages, strict regulations were imposed about who could be buried inside. Yet, as with many rules in medieval society, wealth and influence often bent the restrictions. For every prohibition, there were exceptions granted to nobles, bishops, and wealthy patrons whose money could ease the consciences of church officials. The cathedral became layered stone upon stone, body upon body, floor rebuilt over earlier burials until the very structure seemed to grow out of the dead. Excavations conducted in the 20th century offered glimpses into this subterranean world. In the process of repairs and archaeological surveys, human remains were found beneath worn flagstones, some disturbed by centuries of renovations, others still lying in the position in which they were placed. One particularly striking find was the discovery of burials that appeared to have been hastily arranged, possibly during times of plague. The Black Death, which swept through England in the mid-14th century, filled burial grounds at an alarming pace. It is not unthinkable that even the cathedral, with its immense prestige, became a site where bodies were hurriedly interred when local cemeteries could not cope with the demand. The Black Death left its mark not just on bones, but on the very culture of Canterbury. Pilgrimages surged in the aftermath of plague years as people sought spiritual comfort and healing. At the same time, the cathedral's underground became more crowded with the dead. The idea of being buried near Becket's shrine gained renewed urgency, as if proximity to a saint could serve as a shield against the unpredictable side of death. And so, while the cathedral's architecture soared ever higher, its spires pointing heavenward, its glass gleaming with biblical stories, the ground beneath it filled silently with those who came not to marvel, but to remain. These were not pilgrims who completed their journey with offerings at the shrine. These were pilgrims whose final destination was the cold stone floor of Canterbury itself. It is here, in this juxtaposition, that the story of Canterbury's hidden bones becomes strangely compelling. Above, the voices of choirs, the light of stained glass, the grandeur of kings kneeling in pilgrimage. Below, silence. The bones of masons who cut the stone, the bones of bakers who sold bread to those masons, the bones of mothers who perhaps prayed for their children at Becket's altar. No inscriptions mark their names, no monuments declare their deeds, and yet they rest within the same walls that housed the shrine of a saint and the prayers of kings. Their silence raises questions that linger still. Who were these people whose remains now lie forgotten beneath the cathedral? Were they granted burial out of charity, a final act of mercy by the church? Or were their places bought at great cost, a family's savings poured into securing sanctity for the soul of a loved one? Did they know that, centuries later, archaeologists would carefully brush away the dust from their bones, piecing together the long-forgotten rhythms of their lives? The silence beneath Canterbury is not just about bones, it is about memory. Those who rest there were once alive, once part of the city's bustling medieval life. Now they are little more than shadows in the archaeological record, anonymous figures beneath the feet of modern worshippers. Their presence turns every step across the cathedral floor into a quiet communion with the past, a reminder that beneath the grandest monuments of history lie the most ordinary of human stories. And so, as we stand in Canterbury's nave, marveling at its architecture and recalling the drama of Becket's martyrdom, we might pause to wonder how many unmarked lives, how many silent bones still rest beneath the stones on which we walk. Asterisk, the stone floor of Canterbury Cathedral, worn smooth by centuries of feet, has always been more than stone. It was, for those who lived within its walls, a quiet ledger of memory. Monks who walked its cloisters with candles, bishops who processed in long trains of silk and incense, pilgrims who shuffled barefoot as a sign of penance left faint, invisible marks on that surface, and beneath the floor, in the earth and vaults below, the bones of the faithful and the powerful alike were laid to rest, forming a silent congregation of their own. By the 13th century, Canterbury had become one of the greatest pilgrimage centers in all of Europe, largely because of one man, Thomas Becket, the archbishop whose murder in 1170 shocked Christendom was raised to sainthood within a few years, and his shrine became a beacon that drew thousands across muddy English roads. Yet what pilgrims often did not realize was that while they knelt at his glittering shrine, the very floor they leaned upon concealed other, far less visible relics, anonymous bones tucked away without grandeur. The monks of Canterbury were acutely aware of these presences. The bones beneath were not merely remnants, but reminders, belonged to monks who had spent lifetimes chanting in the choir stalls, bishops who had wrestled with the king's will, anonymous benefactors who had given money for the cathedral's fabric, and even local townsfolk whose lives had intertwined with the sacred place. Each vault, chamber, and ossuary had a story, though most went unwritten. The record books might mention a donation or a funeral date, but the daily breath, sweat, and fears of those people evaporated, leaving only stone markers and bones. The monastic routine and the hidden graves life for the monks who guarded these crypts was monotonous, almost deliberately dull. They rose in the dark hours before dawn to chant the first office of the day. Their voices, carried upward by the stone vaults, mingled with the silence of the crypt below. Few ever descended to those hidden chambers, except when duty required it, carrying a bier, arranging a burial, or relocating remains when new building works disturbed the earth. When the great choir of the cathedral was rebuilt in the years after Beckett's canonization. Masons and laborers frequently encountered bones while digging foundations. Chronicles record little of these discoveries. They were ordinary, expected. Bones were gathered respectfully, sometimes reburied in communal pits, sometimes stored in ossuaries. The monks might have whispered prayers, not because they knew the names of the dead, but because anonymity itself demanded reverence. There is a strange equality in forgotten bones. A grand knight who once thundered across battlefields might lie beside a servant who tended kitchen fires. Their earthly roles dissolved once their names slipped from memory. The monks of Canterbury understood this well. They were surrounded daily by the reminder that life's noise and ambition ended in stillness beneath the floor. The pilgrims above and the bones below pilgrimage, however, was not a quiet matter. Thousands flocked to Canterbury, crowding its streets, jostling for position in the nave, pressing their foreheads against Becket's shrine. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, captures the sense of variety and noise. Merchants, millers, knights, wives, all mingling on the road, each carrying their own reasons for seeking Becket's intercession. The pilgrims came for healing, forgiveness, adventure, or curiosity. Some left behind tokens, wax images of healed limbs, coins, or cloth. Their noise filled the cathedral, their footsteps echoing across the same stones that sealed the crypts below. To the monks, the contrast was stark. Above, the living bustled, with demands and chatter. Below, silence pressed heavily, broken only by the occasional settling of stone or drip of water. One cannot help but imagine the strange dialogue between the two realms. A pilgrim might weep openly for relief from illness, while a few feet beneath them lay bones that had endured centuries without voice or plea. Did the monks ever sense that irony, that the loudest prayers of the living were uttered upon the mute remains of the long-forgotten, the martyrs of quietness? Though Thomas Becket's death defined Canterbury, it was not the only martyr associated with its walls. Centuries before, in the early days of Anglo-Saxon Christianity, monks had spoken of martyrs whose bones were hidden in Kentish soil, relics preserved in local churches or monasteries. Some were later said to have been translated to Canterbury for safety during raids. Whether or not every account was true, the belief shaped how the monks viewed the bones beneath them as potential relics, bearers of holiness even if their names were lost. Archaeological studies in the 20th century revealed that some bones in the crypt were reburials from earlier structures, shifted to make way for later expansions. This suggests the monks themselves recognized that they were custodians of a layered past. Each generation built upon the previous, both architecturally and spiritually. And so, bones, once buried in humble chapels, might end up beneath the soaring Gothic nave. Their anonymity preserved, but their resting place transformed. The crypt, then, was not only a place of the dead, but a palimpsest of faith. Each chamber, layered over the previous, each burial a reminder that Canterbury's holiness was not created in a single moment, but accumulated through centuries of quiet, devotion, and forgotten sacrifice. Earthly concerns, property, money, and memory there is also a practical side to all this, one that feels undeniably mundane. Medieval cathedrals were not just spiritual centers, but powerful landlords. Canterbury controlled vast estates, collected rents, and managed finances with care. Burials within or near the cathedral often involved payments, sometimes generous gifts, sometimes modest offerings. Records show donations tied to burial requests, families ensuring prayers for the departed in exchange for land or coin. This commercial aspect means that the bones beneath Canterbury were, in some sense, part of the cathedral's economy. Represented agreements, promises, and exchanges. Each grave was both a spiritual hope and a financial transaction. Even the most sacred spaces bore the mark of human negotiation. Yet, money cannot preserve memory indefinitely. Over time, inscriptions wore away, families died out, and documents crumbled. The economic logic of burial dissolved, leaving only the bones. So what once had been carefully planned with prayer and payment ended in the same silence as all else. The monk's perspective, we might wonder what the monks themselves thought when they tended to these burials. Their daily lives were bound by routine, but routine fosters reflection. As they processed into the choir for matins at midnight, candles flickering in the chill, they likely felt the weight of history pressing from beneath their feet. The crypt was a physical reminder of what awaited them. Not a shrine like Beckett's with gold and gems, but anonymity, silence, and forgotten rest. The monk's perspective, we might wonder what the monks themselves thought when they tended to these burials. Their daily lives were bound by routine, but routine fosters reflection. So they processed into the choir for matins at midnight, candles flickering in the chill. They likely felt the weight of history pressing from beneath their feet. The crypt was a physical reminder of what awaited them. Not a shrine like Beckett's with gold and gems, but anonymity, silence, and forgotten rest. The monks' writings, though rarely personal, hint at such awareness. They speak often of humility, of life as a passing shadow, of the need to prepare the soul for death. They copied scriptures that reminded them of dust returning to dust. They sang psalms that equated human life with grass that withers by evening, for men who lived above a sea of bones. Such metaphors were not abstract. They were immediate realities, unanswered questions, and so, beneath the famous story of Beckett's shrine lies another, quieter narrative, that of countless others who shared his cathedral, but not his fame. Their bones remain sealed in earth and stone, their names erased, their stories swallowed. Canterbury became a site of dazzling pilgrimage, but its foundation was built upon silence, literal silence, the silence of the dead. We are left to ask, what did those bones once witness? Did they belong to monks who knew Augustine, the first missionary to Canterbury? Two women who carried water through its cloisters before burial was restricted to men of the chapter. Two children who died before they could learn to pray. No record answers these questions. The silence remains ... by the time we reach the conclusion of this quiet thread of history. The bones beneath Canterbury's cathedral are more than relics. They are voices, though hushed, speaking to the way memory, devotion, and institutional power weave themselves together. In this final exploration, we turn toward the fate of those silent bones, not just how they came to rest, but how their presence still matters centuries later. Imagine again the floor of the cathedral, polished by the feet of millions. Beneath those stones lie the carefully constructed vaults and passages we have already walked through. Down there are chambers not only for Thomas Becket, whose death in 1170 redefined Canterbury's meaning to medieval Christendom, but also for bishops, monks, and nameless servants who labored for the church. By the 14th century, the crypt at Canterbury had become not only a burial ground, but a storehouse of memory. And yet, what remains today is fragmentary. During the turbulent 16th century, when Henry VIII severed England from Rome, the shrine of Becket was destroyed. Gold, jewels, and carved marble were stripped away. Relics that once drew pilgrims from across Europe were reduced to dust or scattered. The bones of Becket himself, once encased in glittering reliquaries, vanished. The official decree was silence. His cult was erased from calendars, his name forbidden in public devotion. The bones of saints, once the pride of Canterbury, suddenly became suspect. Yet, the earth beneath the cathedral still kept its secrets. Ordinary burials remained untouched, hidden in the fabric of stone. That is where archaeologists have quietly turned their attention. In the 19th century, when restoration swept through Canterbury Cathedral, workers sometimes stumbled upon bones in bricked-up niches or disturbed soil. Records show that many were reburied quickly, often without much study, reflecting a Victorian respect for the sanctity of graves. Later, in the 20th century, excavation became more careful and skeletons were catalogued. Some revealed evidence of disease or deformity, suggesting that the crypt was also a place where the sick or maimed might have sought burial close to the sacred. The bones spoke less of glory than of fragility. What does it mean that Beckett's bones, once at the center of medieval devotion, are gone, while countless unknown remains endure? One answer lies in how memory works. The destruction of Beckett's shrine was meant to silence his voice forever. Yet, in doing so, it only ensured that silence itself became part of his story. The very absence of his relics now compels attention. Visitors wonder what became of them. Were they destroyed, hidden, secretly preserved in some undiscovered recess? Meanwhile, the bones of unnamed monks or townsfolk, quietly interred, persist in their anonymity. They remind us that history is not only about great figures, but also about those who labored unseen. There is also the matter of the crypt's ongoing role in devotion. Even after Beckett's shrine was gone, the underground chapels continued to be used for prayer. Pilgrims might not have been able to touch his golden reliquary, but they could still descend into the dim light of the crypt, kneel among the heavy columns, and sense the weight of centuries. To this day, the crypt at Canterbury remains one of the largest in Europe. Its silence is perhaps more powerful than the noise of relics and jewels that once dazzled the medieval imagination. The bones are not displayed, but their presence is felt in the stillness. From a more practical angle, the bones beneath Canterbury also reveal information about medieval diet, health, and living conditions. Studies of skeletal remains have shown wear on joints from heavy labor, signs of malnutrition during childhood, and evidence of diseases like tuberculosis. These findings remind us that the cathedral was not simply a monument to faith, but part of a community where suffering and endurance were daily realities. The bones make the abstract concrete behind the grandeur of the nave. Real human bodies struggled, worked, and aged, and yet, perhaps the most striking feature of the silent bones of Canterbury is their ability to hold contradiction. On the one hand, they are evidence material remains that can be measured and studied. On the other hand, they are symbols fragments of lives absorbed into the narrative of one of Christianity's most famous cathedrals. To look at them is to see both the ordinary and the sacred. The bones belong to people who lived through the rhythms of prayer and work, who knew hunger, illness, and fleeting joys. And yet, by resting beneath the cathedral floor, they became part of a story larger than themselves, bound forever to Beckett's martyrdom and to the centuries of devotion that followed. Today, when visitors walk across the cathedral floor, they are not encouraged to think of bones beneath their feet. The guidebooks point to stained glass, to soaring arches, to the site where Becket fell, but the silence remains. Archaeologists know that hundreds of burials still lie sealed in the crypt and chapels, untouched since the Middle Ages. Their anonymity does not diminish their meaning. Instead, it deepens it. The unknown dead remind us that history is never fully told, and that the past is built upon countless lives that leave little more than bones in the soil. So what was hidden beneath the floor of Canterbury Cathedral? Not simply the bones of a saint, but the layered remains of a whole community, famous and obscure, powerful and forgotten. Their silence is the kind of history that lingers, not in dazzling stories of miracles, but in the dull persistence of matter. Stones rest upon bones, and bones upon earth. And the cathedral continues to rise above them all. And yet, one question lingers. If the bones of Thomas Becket himself could vanish so completely, while the bones of countless unknowns remain, what does that say about how we remember the past? Do we cling to names and stories while overlooking the anonymous lives that gave them meaning? Or do the silent bones beneath Canterbury suggest that, in the end, memory belongs as much to the nameless as to the famous? Asterisk beneath the bustling streets of Cologne, where the Rhine flows steadily as it has for centuries, there lies a city within a city. To walk the cobbled lanes today, lined with cafes, modern shops, taste in the towering silhouette of the great Gothic cathedral, is to forget that under these stones exists an older memory, one that belonged first to Rome, then to the Franks, and, later, to the guardians of Christendom. Cologne has always been a place where power layered itself stone upon stone, never fully bearing what came before, but folding it into silence, sealing it beneath the weight of new ambition. The great cathedral, Cologne's beating heart, dominates every skyline and every story about the city. Its spires are among the highest in Europe, but what few pause to consider is that beneath its foundations lie remnants of the city's oldest secrets. Before the cathedral was raised, before the bells ever rang, Roman governors built their praetorium. Here, a palace of power whose walls still lie beneath the cathedral square, and deeper still, in crypts, in sealed vaults, lie treasures, hidden away treasures, not of gold alone, but of memory, of faith, of fear, and of desperation. The Romans had chosen this site carefully. Cologne, or Colonia, Claudia, Era Agrippinensium, as it was called in the 1st century, was a frontier city, a Roman outpost against the restless tribes beyond the Rhine. They built stone walls, amphitheaters, and baths. They carved roads that would outlast their empire. But in the praetorium, the governor kept his records, his orders, and his sacred objects, tokens of imperial Rome, meant to remind citizens of their place in the vast machinery of the empire. When the empire began to wane, some of these objects disappeared. Were they carried back to Rome, or buried under Cologne's earth, sealed away to keep them safe from the chaos to come? No one can say with certainty, though fragments of marble, inscriptions, and carved altars still whisper of a presence just below modern footsteps. As centuries shifted, Cologne became a Frankish stronghold, then a Christian one. The city became known less for its Roman past than for its holy relics. By the Middle Ages, Cologne was said to hold one of the greatest treasures in all Christendom, the bones of the Magi, 3 wise men who had journeyed to Bethlehem. Their reliquary, fashioned in gold and studded with jewels, was displayed in the cathedral, drawing pilgrims from across Europe. To guard such treasure, vaults were reinforced, crypts sealed, and heavy doors locked with iron. Yet, with each new stone laid above, the city pressed its secrets further downward, compressing them into shadow and silence. What haunts historians, however, is not only the grandeur of Cologne's visible treasures, but the unmarked absences beneath. Medieval records speak of reliquaries quietly listed as moved to safe place, of manuscripts catalogued but never resurfaced, of treasures inventoried before war but missing afterward. Fires, sieges, and even the bombings of the 20th century destroyed much. Yes, but the pattern suggests something else: deliberate concealment. Some believe the clergy, fearing both invasion and theft, sealed these items beneath the cathedral floor in chambers whose entrances were bricked over, their locations known only to a small circle sworn to silence. During modern excavations beneath the cathedral square, archaeologists found layered remains of Cologne's past Roman foundations, medieval walls, cellars filled with pottery and coins. Yet, certain sections remain inaccessible, bricked corridors leading nowhere, doors that open onto walls of stone. Were they structural reinforcements, or were they intentional barriers laid to hide what lay beyond? Those who mapped these spaces often left their notes vague, as if uncertainty was easier than speculation. But Cologne's silence is rarely complete. In 1794, when French revolutionary forces marched into the city, clerics frantically moved cathedral treasures to prevent seizure. Some were transported upriver to safe monasteries, while others vanished without record. Rumors spread among citizens that priests had lowered chests into the old Roman cellars and bricked them over in haste. The French searched, but the vaults beneath the cathedral were labyrinthine, and the soldiers were impatient. Whatever was hidden remained so. After the French departed, some treasures returned, others did not, and questions deepened. Walking today along the streets around the Dome, it is almost impossible to sense these layers. Tourists pass through the square in waves, taking photos of the spires or drinking coffee in the shadow of history. Yet, if you stand quietly, perhaps late, in the evening when the bells have ceased their tolling, you may feel the faint hum of the city's subterranean life. The stones are not silent. They resonate with weight, with centuries of footsteps, with the hush of prayers whispered into crypt air. Somewhere below, treasures objects, sacred and profaned still wait, sealed behind Cologne's stones. Some scholars have argued that the true treasure is not material at all, but the very layering of history itself. To descend beneath the cathedral is to walk down a staircase of time, first through Gothic chapels, then Roman walls, then fragments of even older shrines. Its layer was meant to cover the last, yet never succeeded in erasing it. These treasures, sealed here, may not glitter in the way pilgrims once hoped. They may be fragments of manuscripts, bone reliquaries, or small Roman altars forgotten when faiths changed. But what makes them powerful is that they remain beyond reach known, but not touched. Cologne has faced devastation many times. Fires burned through medieval quarters, wars toppled walls, and in the Second World War, bombs fell relentlessly, leaving the city in ruins. Yet the cathedral stood, blackened but upright, its vaults beneath, shaken but not destroyed. Survivors reported that even amid rubble, the crypts remained sealed, their stones immovable, their silence intact. Perhaps it is this silence itself that is the true reliquary, the endurance of what is hidden, resisting time, resisting violence, resisting discovery. As with so many medieval mysteries, we are left only with questions, or treasures deliberately buried beneath Cologne's stones, or have centuries of rumor magnified fragments into legends. Did clerics, in fear of invaders, seal their reliquaries below the cathedral, never to be retrieved? Or do we walk today above nothing more than layers of forgotten stone, mistaking absence for secrecy? The silence offers no answer. It leaves only the weight of possibility pressing down from beneath our feet. Cologne in the 12th century was no ordinary city. It had grown into one of the wealthiest trade centers of the Holy Roman Empire, a place where spices from the Levant, wool from England, and silver from the German mines all converged. Its citizens, merchants, goldsmiths, and clerics understood the delicate balance of faith and fortune that held their city together. But beneath that prosperity, there was unease. Cologne was vulnerable, sitting along the Rhine, exposed to armies, raiders, and jealous rivals. And in the shadow of its mighty cathedral in progress, whispers spread of something far more troubling, treasures hidden below the very stones of the city. Those whispers did not begin with merchants, nor even with the clergy. They began with builders, the stonemasons, the diggers, the men whose hands tore into the earth to shape Cologne's future. When the foundations of the cathedral were being prepared, older stones were struck, stones that did not belong to the medieval church, but to something older, deeper. The Romans had been there 1,000 years before, leaving behind baths, walls, and shrines. Cologne was, after all, once Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, a proud Roman colony. And with every shovel that bit into the soil, some remnant of that older world came to light. The builders told of carved slabs, of strange inscriptions that no one could read, of bones that were too large to belong to ordinary men. Some claimed they saw fragments of golden fittings clinging to the dust, quickly brushed away by foremen who told them to be silent. Others said they found hollows in the ground, ancient crypts sealed not with Christian crosses, but with pagan sigils. Few dared linger over these discoveries, for Cologne was a city where rumors could become dangerous. The church would not tolerate talk of ancient idols or forbidden hoards beneath their sacred worksite. And yet, the stories spread, carried from mason to tavern, from tavern to household, till they became part of the city's breath by the mid-13th century. A tale had settled into the minds of the people. Beneath Cologne lay a sealed chamber, a reliquary unlike any other. Some said it was Roman, others insisted it was older still. The treasure within was not merely gold, but wisdom, a library of stone tablets, a record of civilizations long erased. Others insisted it was sacred, a hoard of relics gathered by bishops and hidden away during invasions when Hungarians or Normans swept across the land. Whatever the truth, the people of Cologne believed that their city sat atop something meant never to be disturbed. The clergy's response was telling. When asked directly, they denied nothing but confirmed nothing either. Preachers spoke instead of the city as a new Jerusalem, built on holy ground, chosen by God. Was this not, they suggested, treasure enough? But their evasions only deepened suspicion. Why avoid answering if there was nothing to hide? Why did the bishop's men so often accompany excavation, ensuring that no fragments escaped their watchful eyes? Merchants had their own interpretation. For them, sealed hoard beneath Cologne was symbolic of the city's destiny to be not only a hub of trade, but a guardian of wealth, chosen to keep what others could not be trusted to hold. And in their quiet conversations, they wondered whether this hidden reliquary was why Cologne prospered, why its markets thrived, while others faltered. Was it, perhaps, the invisible anchor of their fortune? By the 14th century, the story had hardened into something closer to legend. Pilgrims, who already flocked to Cologne to venerate the shrine of the Three Kings, whispered among themselves of another shrine, one not displayed above the altar, but buried deep beneath this city's stones. Some said it was the true resting place of the Magi, that the relics displayed in the cathedral were but a cover for the real treasure sealed underground. Others believed that saints who had died unknown, martyrs of the first centuries, lay hidden in untouched crypts, their bones glowing faintly with a holy light. The ordinary people of Cologne wove these fragments into daily life. Mothers threatened unruly children that if they disobeyed, the bones beneath the stones would stir and rise. Young men boasted that one day they would dig down and uncover treasures enough to buy their freedom from guild obligations. Old men swore they had seen nights when the cobbles near the cathedral glowed faintly, as if something beneath them breathed, and still, no one ever found it, or so it seemed, in the archives of Cologne. There exists a strange record from the year 1349, the year of plague. The city, like much of Europe, was ravaged by death. Fear ran through the streets, corpses piled at church doors. Amidst the chaos, a mason's account tells of a chamber uncovered near the cathedral's cloisters. He described walls smooth as marble, but black as soot, an air that reeked of old incense. He and his companions fled, sealing it again as quickly as they could. Days later, the record says, all of them were dead not from plague, but from sudden collapse. Their deaths, unexplained, were taken as divine punishment for prying where no man was meant to look. The chamber was never spoken of again, at least not openly. The city had other fears the Jews accused, the plague spreading, commerce collapsing. But in hushed corners, the tale endured. During the year of death, Cologne had brushed against its buried reliquary, and the reliquary had exacted a price. Over the centuries, as the cathedral rose higher, the story never entirely faded. Builders spoke of hollow sounds when they drove stakes into the earth, of echoes that did not belong to empty soil. Clergy wrote sermons reminding the people that not all treasures are meant to be seen, and travelers continued to ask in taverns and along the docks if it was true that Cologne stood above sealed bones and sealed treasures by the time the modern era arrived. With rational scholars and scientific excavation, the reliquary of legend had become almost a metaphor. It was cited as evidence of the city's deep past, a reminder that Cologne was layered like a palimpsest, each age writing over the last, but some antiquarians digging in the 19th century found strange alignments in the ground beneath the cathedral, walls that did not match Roman plans, voids that resisted exploration. They could not confirm what lay there, and perhaps they feared to push further. Even today, the question lingers: what was sealed beneath Cologne stones? Was it truly treasure, or merely the accumulated fragments of forgotten centuries? The silence of the stones gives no answer, but the persistence of the whispers tells us something else: that cities, like people, keep secrets in their bones. And sometimes, the greatest relics are not displayed in golden shrines, but hidden in the darkness below, where time itself becomes their guardian. Asterisk, the Cathedral of Cologne rose higher and higher across the centuries, a structure so vast in ambition that those who first laid its foundation stones never lived to see it finished. It was a church built as if to rival heaven itself, but what lay beneath it, in the layers of earth and silence, was perhaps more telling than all the soaring buttresses above. The lower crypts, dimly lit and narrow, were a different world from the jeweled altars above. Here, the smell of damp stone lingered, mixed with the faint mineral temps of the Rhine that seeped invisibly through the earth. Priests carried torches into these vaults only when necessary, and the flickering flames revealed alcoves, cavities, and sealed chambers whose doors were not meant to be disturbed. In these crypts, treasures were hidden, not treasures of gold. Coins stacked carelessly, but objects deemed sacred, charged with power, and sometimes even dangerous. Cologne's clergy, ever aware of both piety and politics, understood that certain relics could inspire faith or inflamed envy. To leave them exposed was to risk desecration or theft. Better, they reasoned, to bury them beneath the cathedral stones, in silence. One such treasure was said to be an ivory reliquary small, carved with scenes of saints, its surface smoothed by centuries of handling. It was rumored to hold bone fragments from martyrs of the early church, men and women who had died nameless in the persecutions of Rome. Unlike the famed relics displayed above, such as the Shrine of the Magi, which drew pilgrims from across Christendom, this reliquary remained hidden. The faithful were not told of it. It was kept in darkness, as if its presence were a burden too heavy to bring into daylight. The crypts themselves, however, bore witness. Pilgrims sometimes whispered, a feeling an odd pressure as they descended, as if the very air carried weight. Chroniclers noted with curiosity that the masons of the cathedral often found their chisels blunted more quickly in these lower vaults, the stone resisting with unusual hardness. Some suggested this was a sign that the ground itself was consecrated, unwilling to yield its secrets easily. Yet not all who worked in these passages believed such things. One mason, writing in a rare surviving account, recorded that while repairing a collapsed arch in the mid-3rd century, he discovered a cavity behind a wall, carefully bricked over. Within, it was a lead box, too heavy for him to carry alone. When he summoned the priest in charge of the works, the box was quietly removed, and he never saw it again. What it contained, he could only guess, but his words, preserved in an obscure guild manuscript, gave future historians reason to suspect that the cathedral's vaults housed more than bones and ivory. Over time, these crypts became layered, not only with physical deposits, but also with silence. War swept over colonies during the Napoleonic era, its bombings during the Second World War, yet somehow certain subterranean chambers were spared or quickly resealed. when much of the city lay in ruins in 1945. Local historians noted that some sealed sections of the crypt were deliberately left unopened by restorers, as if even amid devastation there remained a hesitation to disturb what lay beneath. Why such secrecy? Theories grew like ivy. Some argued that the hidden relics included writings too dangerous to reveal texts questioning the authority of bishops, perhaps, or fragments of forgotten gospels. Others claimed that the objects themselves carried a history of unrest, chalices looted in wars, jewels once belonging to rival cities, offerings made under duress. To bring them out would be to reignite disputes long cooled. The city's own relationship with relics was complex. Cologne was known across Europe as a treasury of saints. Pilgrims filled its streets, bringing wealth and commerce, kneeling before shrines heavy with gold. What if, beneath the surface, there were relics kept not to inspire, but to restrain? What if the cathedral's hidden vaults held objects that told an altogether different story of conflict, of betrayal, of uneasy bargains struck in silence, occasionally hints escaped? In the late 19th century, during one of the cathedral's many restorations, a workman claimed to have found fragments of a reliquary depicting strange hybrid creatures, half animal, half human, carved in ivory. His report was dismissed as imagination, for such images did not fit the solemn piety expected of relics. Yet his description matched artistic motifs more common in pre-Christian or early medieval art, where the boundaries between sacred and profane were less rigid. If true, what such a reliquary was doing sealed beneath Cologne's stones remained unanswered, and so the crypt became a paradox, a place where presence was marked by absence, where meaning was conveyed through concealment. The cathedral above declared glory, triumph, and revelation. The vaults below whispered of secrecy, caution, things withheld. In wandering the space today, one notices how the stones seems to absorb footsteps. Light from a candle fades quickly into shadows, and the walls feel closer than they are. Tourists pass quickly, more eager to see the stained glass in the spires than the damp silence beneath. Yet if one lingers, listening carefully, there is a sense that these stones still guard their burden. Some questions emerge quietly, as if breathed by the walls themselves. Were the treasures sealed away for protection or for suppression? Were they hidden because they were too holy or because they were too troubling? And if they were unearthed now, would they change how we see the cathedral, or even how we see the church itself? The truth remains locked away. Cologne's cathedral, towering above, is one of the most visible symbols of faith in Europe. But its deepest legacy may lie not in the spires that scrape the sky, but in the sealed chambers below, where history chose to bury what it could not bear to reveal. And so the stones remain, layered with silence, beneath the chants and organ tones, beneath the weight of centuries. They keep their secrets, quiet, patient, and enduring. Asterisk, if you enter Toledo by the old bridges and climb the labyrinth of streets toward the high plateau, you feel the city's layers underfoot. The stones are roaming in one stretch, Visigothic in another, then Moorish brick bands appear in a doorway arch. And finally, a late Gothic tracery glints in the sun from a chapel window. The cathedral, Santa Maria de Toledo, the primatial church of Spain, does not stand apart from those layers. It is there, to understand what might be hidden beneath its floors, you have to think less like a sightseer and more like a mason, a clerk, or a sacristan, moving through work that is repetitive, precise, and patient. Beneath the famous nave are spaces shaped by such patience: sub-vaults, drains, burial cavities, small storage bays, and chapels that functioned as much as workrooms, as shrines. The extraordinary lives above depend on ordinary spaces below. The site itself has deep memory. Long before the cathedral's Gothic fabric was begun in 1226 under King Ferdinand III and Archbishop Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada, a Visigothic basilica stood here, likely dedicated to Saint Mary. During the centuries of Islamic rule, a great mosque occupied the ground. When Alfonso VI took Toledo in 1085, that mosque became the cathedral, while plans for a wholly new church matured slowly. When Gothic work finally started, the builders found not clean bedrock, but a palimpsest courses of earlier walls, reused columns, and compacted soils already threaded with cisterns and conduits. Instead of erasing the past, the new church absorbed it, cutting earlier voids into foundations and earlier foundations into voids. The result is a building whose 5 naves and double ambulatory rest on a honeycomb. The visible forest of clustered piers repeats below as heavier, squatter supports that carry the weight down to the hill's crown. Some of those lower bays are full-height crypt rooms. Others are only crawl spaces into which a mason would have pushed himself with a lamp, checking a pier's settling or repointing line where damp crept in. The upper church sings, under church listens. Fabric makes you notice the ordinary necessities. Drainage, for instance. The Mesa of Toledo collects sudden rain. The cathedral's pavements are slightly cambered to shed water toward discrete gratings at stone joints. Beneath those gratings run stone-lined channels that fall by small steps toward the cliff, where water once exited into older Roman or Islamic drains. A sacristan in the 15th century would have known the circuit by heart. Lift the bronze plate. Reach in, clear grit with a hook. Push a mop into the chute. Replace the plate. This was dull work, but it kept the choir dry and the marble altars safe from swelling salts. If you follow these chutes in your mind, they bring you to places no pilgrim sees, pockets where runoff slowed and left sealed, recesses where lamp oil and candle wax congealed, corners where a lost coin might vanish and be found a century later by someone. Cleaning the channel by touch. Alongside channels came chambers, not the romantic secret rooms of legend, but practical subspaces the Spanish call sotanos, undercrofts, underchapels, low bays beneath sacristies, and narrow barrel vaults beneath processional aisles. Many were simple burial cavities, as in other great cathedrals. Toledo interred canons, archbishops, and wealthy patrons under its paving. Sepulchral slabs along the aisles are only the visible index of a much larger ledger below. In some places, when floors were relaid, bones were gathered into ossuaries, tucked into wall niches, a tidy solution born of necessity. To map the burials is to map the cathedral's institutional memory. Here, a 13th century canon with his lead cross. There, a 14th century prelate whose tomb chest rests over a low void that still smells faintly of lime, near the Capilla Mare high altar. The cathedral's plan complicates itself. Behind the towering retableau of polychrome carvings is an axial procession of spaces, the ambulatory, a screen, a narrow cameron, a tiny room of the image used to tend the great altarpiece, can cut through in the 18th century. Transparent, a bold Baroque opening and sculptural window by Narciso Tome that brings a shaft of daylight down to the tabernacle. That dramatic skylight, admired now for its swirl of angels and rock, is also a reminder that light must pass through mass. Tome as masons cut an oculus through vault and webbing, and, inevitably, their spoil fell first onto a platform of scaffolds, then into the tight service cavities below the ambulatory, somewhere beneath the gleam. There are still places where construction dust settled and never moved again. The cathedral's sacristy and chapter house is also right above useful subspaces. The sacristy houses vestments, chalices, and in later centuries paintings. Below it lie storerooms that once held linens, oils, and the supplies that allow a liturgical machine to run. Beeswax in bulk, charcoal for incense, vinegar for cleaning. If you imagine a sacristan's week, you begin to see the rhythms of the underfloor life. Monday for inventory, Tuesday for mending, Wednesday for scraping wax and pushing it to the edge of a tile where a boy with a knife could pop it free. A cathedral is built on such unshowy work. Even the treasury's famous custodia d'art, the towering silver-gilt monstrance that carries the consecrated host in the Corpus Christi procession, depended on these routines. Its candles, its canopy, its punctual appearance, all required. Storerooms and hands you never see. Toledo's Mozarabic Chapel, founded by Cardinal Cisneros around 1500 to keep the ancient Hispanic rite alive after the Reconquista, sits on yet another layer. The Mozarabic rite needed its own books, its own calendar, and since it ran on a different cycle of readings and feasts, its own storage. Below the pavement, small bays kept chant books dry and away from the busier Roman Rite sacristy. There is nothing romantic in a vented cavity sized to a folio, but a rite survives because someone remembered to set a shelf with airflow and to lift the books during damp spells. The city under the city matters too. Toledo is famous for its subterranean cisterns and baths, especially in the old Medina quarter, north of the cathedral. Long before Gothic buttresses reached into the sky, Roman cisterns and Islamic qanats gathered water in the rock. When the cathedral grew, its drains and cellars inevitably nodded into that older infrastructure. Builders reused brick rings from cisterns as footings. Surveyors traced hollow sounds with mallets and set their piers away from voids. If you were a 13th century foreman pacing the marking lines for a new chapel, you would have listened for the drum of emptiness beneath and shifted a pier slightly to land it on rock. The plan we see above is, in places, a map of absences below. Toledo's underfloors were also archives in a strictly practical sense. Although the cathedral's archive, capitular chapter archive, resides in upper rooms during construction and crisis, the safest place for bundles of charters and rent rolls was a locked bay under stone. Spain's long 16th century ran on paper, prebonds, leases to farmers along the Tagus, contracts with silversmiths, testaments by canons who left money for chapels. Before a clerk sent a fair copy to the archive, a rough packet twine tied, sanded to dry, the ink white sit for a week on a shelf in a dry soda banco under the chapter house stairs. If you stood there then, the smell would be lime, leather, and iron gall. Conflict sharpened the instinct to put things below. In the Napoleonic occupation of the early 19th century, and again during later civil strife, cathedral treasuries across Spain hid what could be carried: reliquaries, plate, portable images. Toledo's practice was like others: valuables, packed into chests, lifted by teams down a side stair, walled for a span of dangerous months behind a temporary skin of brick. With her particular object, this chalice, that small reliquary spent time behind such a skin is often a matter of tradition rather than documentary fact, and careful historians treat such stories as possibilities rather than proofs. But the method is not in doubt. A good hiding place under a church floor is less a secret vault than a short run of blank wall laid overnight across the mouth of a service bay, disguised by a bench or a screen. The point is not impenetrability. It is unremarkability. The cathedral's burial economy left its imprint as well. Like Canterbury or Chartres, Toledo accepted intramurals interments for the high clergy and the great. The practice produced the familiar sight above canopies, effigies, kneeling donors along chapels, but it also built a ledger below. An interment meant a grave pit cut between joists of older masonry, timbers used as temporary shoring, lime poured to dry soft soils, then a careful relaying of paving. After a few generations, maintenance demanded the grim but necessary labor of lifting slabs, collecting disarticulated bones into an ossuary niche, and readying the bay for the next burial. The monotony of this work is part of the point. The underfloor is where the cathedral's ideals, memory, intercession, continuity become a schedule. If you walk the ambulatory today and let your eye fall from gilt and stone to the actual floor, you see clues left by centuries of such schedules. A patch of newer limestone where an older slab sank, set of brass letter nails whose inscription walked when the jointing was redone. A ventilation grill that is not quite symmetrical because it had to miss the corner of a tomb cavity. These are not secrets. They are traces of maintenance, the unending work by which a building carries its weight forward in time. There is, too, the matter of sealed rooms. Visitors sometimes ask the guides about secret chambers, and the answer, if put plainly, disappoints. Most closed spaces are either structural or the result of abandoned stairs, blocked when circulation patterns changed. Yet, blocked does not mean empty. A bricked arch beneath the side. Chapel may close off a now redundant passage that once allowed clergy to reach a crypt altar from behind. In his pocket, there may be only dust, but there can also be the practical sweepings of a sacristan who, in 1620, cues broken candle holders and spent wick clips through a gap rather than carry them round the cloister. Archaeology thrives on such sweepings, and sub-pavement bays have been opened in other Iberian churches. Defines most likely to illuminate daily life are precisely these dull things. Beads from a worn rosary, a folded paper scheduled for a feast's procession, a washer fallen from a processional staff, Toledo's Capilla de San Blas, the late 14th century funerary chapel of Archbishop Tenorio tucked off the cloister, offers a more openly layered case. Above, its walls carry Gothic murals. Below, a modest crypt keeps the archbishop and companions, in between, is always the operative word. Service, cavities, and vents that let the muralists lime dry and the crypts damp out. The chapel's lesson for the larger cathedral is clear. The art and memory we admire depend on the air that moves invisibly. Through slots under the floor, the voids that let salt crystallize on a brick ledge rather than on a saint's painted hymn. From a distance, Toledo's cathedral reads as a single heroic effort. 5 centuries of building, culminating in a church that collected power, wealth, and art. Up close, and especially below, it reads as an accumulation of procedures, clerks, a habit of tying packets with a particular twist, a mason's preference for a slightly fatter lime, sacristan's rule about scraping wax on Thursdays. The hidden chambers are less mystery than method spaces that let methods happen without display. And yet, even with this overview, the mind returns to a more tantalizing possibility. The cathedral's long history includes periods when keeping something sci-fi an image, a relic, a document meant not cataloging it, but losing it, letting it blend into the fabric so completely that only a drawing on a plan, a clerk's marginal note, or the faint hollow sound under a flagged aisle hints at its presence. In a city whose identity is the coexistence of Roman, Visigothic, Islamic, and Christian pasts, the floor indeed sheltered things that belong to more than one story. At one sand Islamic prayer niche turned to face a new altar. A Roman cistern, ring carrying Mozarabic books, a Visigothic marble spolia hidden for strength where no one now can see. The floors of Toledo do not answer directly. They offer, instead, a discipline. Look down, listen for hollows, follow the drains, respect the dullness by which a great building survives. If anything is truly hidden, it is likely to be bound up with that dullness sealed not behind iron doors, but behind the ordinary. And so, as you stand in the nave and feel the pavement cool through your shoes, the unresolved thought remains. What, among all these useful voids and maintenance bays, was once placed deliberately and then allowed to become part of the building's forgetfulness? And would we even recognize it if a loose stone one day revealed it? Asterisk beneath the brilliant sun of central Spain, Toledo appeared from a distance, like a fortress of faith. Its skyline was pierced by the spire of the great cathedral, and its streets spiraled in narrow ribbons down toward the Tagus River. From above, the city looked whole solid, eternal. Yet, beneath its stone houses and crowded alleys, something else stirred. For centuries, whispers lingered about hollow places beneath the city, chambers sealed with mortar, stairways that led to silence, vaults that had not seen air since the Middle Ages. Toledo's history was one of layering. Romans built their forum, Visigoths raised their churches, Muslims carved their mosques, and Christians laid their cathedrals atop them. Every empire left something buried, something unfinished, something forgotten. By the 12th century, when Toledo was known as the city of three cultures, its very foundations had become a kind of palimpsest. Each faith, each dynasty, each conqueror left not only monuments above the ground, but also sealed chambers below, rooms whose purposes were known only to those who bricked them closed. It was said that in the cloisters of San Juan de los Reyes, monks used to walk in circles over stones that echoed strangely, as if hollow beneath. Some claimed they could hear whispers rising through the cracks at night, like prayers spoken into earth itself. In the Jewish quarter, old women swore that certain cellars lead deeper than they should, down into staircases where the air grew damp, till a wall of stone abruptly stopped the way. They sealed it, they would murmur, so that nothing could return. The cathedral, too, bore its secrets. Chroniclers of the 14th century recorded that masons, laying the foundations of one of the chapels, struck an ancient wall beneath. The archbishop ordered the masons to seal it immediately and forbid them to record what they had seen. Only a line in a dusty margin remained, written by a scribe who risked punishment. Morus antiqua sub terra clausis est. An ancient wall is closed beneath the earth. Beyond that line, silence. But rumors never stayed buried. By the 15th century, pilgrims carried tales of treasures hidden in Toledo's depths. Some spoke of reliquaries taken during the Visigothic rule, sealed away when the Moors conquered the city. Others believed Muslim scholars, in fear of Christian armies, bricked away libraries of Arabic manuscripts, knowing that fire or conquest would destroy them. Still others insisted the Christians themselves had hidden dangerous writings, Gnostic gospels, heretical scrolls, forbidden experiments in alchemy. What could not be destroyed, they argued, was sealed. Toledo was not just a city of stone, it was a city of memory. Scholars, priests, and poets all tried to explain its strangeness. One friar, writing in the 16th century, remarked that Toledo was like a body with two faces, one for the sun and one for the shadows. He claimed that every church had its crypt, and every crypt had its door to something older. City is like a honeycomb, he wrote, though some cells have been filled with wax, and some with silence. Not all the whispers were of treasure. Some spoke of darker things. An account from a Jesuit novice in 1602 told of voices heard beneath the sacristy floor during night prayers. The sounds, he wrote, were not Latin or Spanish, but tongues unknown, sharp like flint. His master told him it was imagination, the echo of the wind through hidden cracks. But the novice swore that when he leaned closer, he heard laughter then, dry laughter, as though bones themselves had spoken. Archaeologists, centuries later, would find hints of truth in such tales. In cellars along Calle del Cristo de la Luz, Roman mosaics emerged beneath plaster. In the foundations of San Roman Visigothic stonework stood hidden under later walls. The ground itself was layered in secrecy, but still, much remained unproven. The greatest mystery-sealed vaults, hidden passages, remained untouched, because for every man who spoke of opening them, there were warnings that followed. The warnings often came in the form of stories. A mason, it was said, once broke through into an underground hall beneath the Alcazar. He found steps leading further down, but when he tried to descend, his lamp went out. When he relit it, the steps had vanished, replaced by blank stone. He fled, trembling, and swore never to dig again. Another tale told of a priest who entered a sealed chamber beneath his parish church. He was found days later, muttering prayers backwards, his eyes staring at things no one else could see. He died before dawn. Asterisk whether such stories were truth, superstition, or cautionary invention hardly mattered. In Toledo, they were believed. Children grew up with them. Urchins repeated them as warnings to apprentices. Even scholars, who laughed at peasant superstition, admitted in quiet moments that the city had shadows too deep for reason. What lay beneath Toledo? Was it merely old architecture, forgotten by time? Or was it something chosen, something sealed, for reasons beyond simple neglect? The unanswered questions gave Toledo a strange weight. To walk its streets at night was to feel that beneath every stone, beneath every lantern-lit alley, there was more an older city, a buried city, a city where whispers still traveled. Those who lived there learned to live with it, as one learns, to live with the memory of the dead, unseen but always present. Asterisk, the sense of being watched was not uncommon. Travelers noted that in Toledo, even the walls seemed alive, as though they remembered more than they should. This was not only metaphor in more than one parish. Faint carvings had been found on interior stone-scratched spirals, cryptic initials, strange marks that had no liturgical meaning. Some were dismissed as Masons' symbols, others as idle graffiti. But in Toledo, they took on more sinister interpretations. Were they warnings left by those who had sealed the chambers? Or were they remnants of what the chambers once held? Perhaps the most enduring rumor was that the city held the sealed chamber known as La Camara del Silencio, the Chamber of Silence. According to legend, it was walled up during the time of the Visigoths, rediscovered during Muslim rule, then walled up again, and once more hidden during Christian times. Each faith, each conqueror has supposedly stumbled upon it, only to fear what they found and seal it again. If the story was true, it meant the chamber had endured for over 1,000 years. Like a wound in the city's heart, closed but never healed. What was inside? Some said books, others bones. Some whispered of objects that glowed faintly, even in darkness. The more daring stories spoke of voices and intelligence that lingered in the silence, waiting for listeners. No one could prove it, but the fact that such stories persisted century after century told its own truth, that Toledo was not a city, easily exhausted, not above the ground, nor below. By the dawn of the modern age, explorers from across Europe came to Toledo searching for proof of these chambers. They mapped crypts, cataloged relics, and measured passages. But the deepest secrets remained sealed. Walls resisted excavation. Vaults revealed only silence. And still, the city kept its hold on the imagination. For what could be more haunting than a city where every step, every stone, every shadow might conceal another world beneath? Toledo, the city of three cultures, remained also the city of three silences: the silence of memory, the silence of faith, and the silence of stone. And within that silence, the hidden chambers endured. The stone stair wound downward in deliberate increments, core, its spiral cutting deeper beneath the known floors of Toledo's Alcazar. Each step bore the polish of centuries of passing feet, though not all had walked with freedom. Some had been dragged. Others had descended voluntarily, cloaked in robes, candles flickering, scrolls clasped tight to their chests. At the lowest bend, the stair spilled into a chamber that seemed almost to have been forgotten by the world above. Its air was thick, like parchment that had absorbed too many centuries of dampness. Yet its structure remained strangely intact. No grand carvings adorned these walls. They were stark, functional, fashioned to hold rather than display. And yet, within their silence, a presence lingered like a library whose volumes had been emptied, but whose echoes refused to depart. Here, the hidden chambers began. No chronicles of Toledo make direct mention of them. The city's scribes, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, seemed curiously silent on what lay beneath the Alcazar. Yet, scattered clues survive marginal notes in monastic codices, offhand remarks in Arabic treatises, whispers preserved in Sephardic songs. These hints suggest that Toledo's rulers, be they Visigothic, Caliphal, or Castilian always, kept a place below the fortress that did not belong to the visible order of things. The question remains, what purpose did it serve? Some scholars argue the chambers were nothing more than storage grain bins, cisterns, or vaults. Yet to step into their description is to feel something heavier. Stone vaults curve overhead with an exactness unnecessary for mere granaries. Narrow passages branch away at angles, their proportions too humanly scaled to be accidental. At certain points, faint scratches on the walls appear not as random wear, but as deliberate markings, runes, crosses, stars of David, crescents, all faint, yet layered atop one another. It is as though Toledo's many faiths left faint traces. Here, drawn in chalk, are carved with hesitant knives, reminders of presence before erasure. One theory tells of Visigothic kings in the 7th century, fearing the wrath of Byzantium and the ambitions of rivals, sealed away treasures looted during their rise. These included chalices, reliquaries, and fragments of Roman spoils taken from Italy. When the Umayyad armies swept into Iberia in 711, the story claims the hoard was hidden deeper, sealed behind false walls. Another theory belongs to the era of Al-Andalus. Toledo became famed for its scholars who translated Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew texts into Latin, carrying forgotten wisdom back into Europe. Some of those translators, it is said, descended beneath the Alcazar to work in secrecy. For not all knowledge was safe. Certain manuscripts, astronomy, alchemy, or philosophy provoked accusations of heresy. It's better then to keep them hidden where prying eyes could not intrude. And still another tradition comes from Castile's later centuries, when kings and inquisitors feared subversion within their own walls. It was whispered that prisoners were kept below, their names erased, their bones scattered. Yet no definitive skeletons have ever been found, only faint discolorations on the stone, as though shadows had lingered too long. It is the overlapping of these narratives that makes the chambers of Toledo feel less like physical rooms and more like a palimpsest of memory. Each layer of history pressed itself upon the same walls, leaving faint impressions before vanishing. Some visitors speak of the silence being too complete. A scholar in the 19th century who attempted to map the passages recorded that his candle extinguished without wind. Another reported that footsteps echoed with an odd delay, as though the sound was caught and replayed by the walls themselves. These are anecdotes, of course sizzily dismissed as exaggerations of the romantic imagination. Yet they persist. More curious still is the lack of official excavation. Toledo has welcomed archaeologists, historians, and restorationists into its churches, synagogues, and mosques. But the Alcazar's depths remained curiously underexplored, as if bureaucratic obstacles always intervened. Some cite structural risks, others note military restrictions, for the Alcazar long served as a garrison. But perhaps the truest reason is simply that no one has wanted to disturb whatever sleeps beneath. The memory of the Reconquista still colors the Spanish imagination, as does the memory of convivencia, the uneasy coexistence of Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Perhaps in those chambers all three left behind fragments, intermingled in ways later centuries found uncomfortable. Imagine, then, the hidden room, not as a single-purpose vault, but as a kind of silent archive of memory itself, a place where forgotten scriptures lay beside chalices, where mathematic diagrams rested near reliquary bones, or prisoners carved marks of despair next to astronomers' diagrams of stars. Such juxtapositions would defy later categories of sacred and profane, permitted and forbidden. They would stand as reminders that history is never neat, that its layers intermingle in shadows, walking those passages in imagination. One might picture niches cut into the walls, each once containing an object now removed or lost. One niche, wider than the rest perhaps, for a chest of manuscripts. Another, smaller, with discoloration, shaped like a chalice's base. A third, bearing a faint scratch of Arabic script, translating roughly to "truth lies within." What truths, one wonders, were placed there? Perhaps the chambers of Toledo remained hidden precisely because they resist resolution. To excavate them would be to choose among interpretations, to fix one story as dominant. To leave them sealed allows the mystery itself to live. The silence becomes a kind of protection, not of gold or relics, but of the multiplicity of memories, and so the chambers rest. Their stones drink the moisture of centuries. Their walls retain the warmth of noonday sun, filtering faintly through cracks. Their air gathers the dust of time, each moat carrying whispers of kings, caliphs, monks, and prisoners. In the city above, bells ring, markets bustle, tourists photograph the soaring towers. Life continues, largely unaware of the rooms beneath. But Toledo is a city that has always layered itself Roman walls beneath Visigothic churches, mosques beneath cathedrals, Hebrew inscriptions beneath plaster. The hidden chambers are only the deepest layer, a final reminder that history does not vanish. It sinks quietly, waiting to be remembered, whether treasure or text, prisoner or prayer. The chambers hold what we cannot fully name. Their silence is not emptiness, but a fullness too heavy for words. And in that silence lies the weight of Toledo. Itself its mingled past, its unresolved present, its watchful stones, and so we leave them undisturbed, their doors unsealed only in imagination. Perhaps that is best, for some chambers speak more by remaining closed than they ever would by being opened. Asterisk, if you stand on the parvis of Notre Dame at daybreak, when delivery trucks still outnumber tour groups and the gulls are louder than the bells, the cathedral seems to grow out of the stone of the island itself. This impression is not only poetic. The Isle de la Cite is an old river barge turned to land sediment, packed and repacked by centuries. Everything here is layered. Roman foundations under medieval houses, medieval walls under 19th century boulevards, and beneath the cathedral, beneath the very flags that take the tread of millions lies, a subdued geography of voids, drains, burial vaults, filled layers, lost stairs, and sealed chambers. You look up at flying buttresses. The building answers, gently, ken that its life begins below your feet. Long before the first rib was lifted for the Gothic vaults, the island held another church. Tradition places a late antique Basilica Saint Etienne the site, with Merovingian and Carolingian rebuilding that left bits of reused stone and fragments of tombs. When the canons of Paris decided in the 12th century to raise a cathedral anew, they did not dig into blank earth. They had to thread piles and footings through ground already full of memory. Building a great church here was as much a work of sorting as of lifting. Sort the layers, keep what holds, fill what fails, and make a level surface for all that would come. Notre Dame's body is famously legible above ground nave, choir, transepts, apse, yet the plan repeats below, translated into the grammar of supports. Under the clustered piers that rise like bundled reeds, squat masses of masonry carry weight to the island's compacted soils. Between those masses, narrow bays open, some true crypt rooms, others no more than crawl spaces, where a mason would belly forward with a lamp to check the lime at a joint. Here and there, brick or stone channels run, and if you place your palm on a cool flag by the south aisle and listen, you will hear nothing but in imagination you can trace those channels downhill to the river's edge, where, in older centuries, runoff and seepage found their way to the Seine. The cathedral, on the surface, is made possible by these undramatic underthings. Consider drainage. The nave floor is not perfectly flat. It carries a subtle camber, so rain tracked in by shoes or blown from open doors moves toward discrete grills. Beneath each grill, a stone shoots steps downward, then joins a collector. A sacristan of the 14th or the 17th century would have known this circuit by habit. Lift a bronze plate, cal, grit, push a rag down with a pole, wipe the lip, replace the plate, done, unnoticed, essential. Wax, ash, dropped pins, and the occasional lost coin rode those chutes. Some lodged forever in quiet corners the light never touched. What lay beneath the floor was not only void and water, it was people, like other great churches of Europe. Notre Dame contained burials beneath its paving, canons of the chapter, caciopes and archbishops of Paris, noble patrons, and the occasional celebrated penitent. Ledger stones above announced names. Darker anonymity lay below, as time erased inscriptions and relaid pavements. When floors were adjusted or chapels rebuilt, bones were gathered into walls, and orderliness born of necessity. Under the flags of a side aisle, there might be, even now, the modest rectangle of an emptied grave, its edges carefully relined in lime to keep damp at beyond index of the cathedral's quiet. It's bureaucracy of care. If you want to see with your own eyes how Paris grows by covering itself, you step not into the cathedral, but down from the parvis into the archaeological crypt that opens off the square. There the island's long strata are laid out like a page, fragments of the Roman praetorium walls, bits of hypocaust heating, a T-line of a late antique key, the medieval street grid that once pinched close against the cathedral's western facade, the 19th century cut diagonals through that fabric boulevards. Police prefectures, the tidy edges of a modern capital, and then the 20th century tucked the old bones back under glass and concrete so you could walk among them without breathing dust. A city that does this cuts, records, reburies, exhibits and it stands itself as a palimpsest, script in stone. Inside the church, the understory continued as the upper changed. Chapels multiplied along the ambulatory and aisles. Chantries, endowed by guilds and families, required places for priests to say masses for the dead. Each new installation meant practical work below. Pierce the pavement to carry a lamp wire in. Later centuries, trim a joist of old fill to sink a small vault, open a narrow slot to vent damp from a crypt. These are not the operations you find in guidebooks, but they are the ones that keep a great building honest with itself, that wed its ceremonial ambition to maintenance and air dot. The clergy's routines knitted the worlds above and below. In the treasury, moved and refitted over centuries. Chalices, reliquaries, vestments were cataloged with the same care as account books listing rents from farmlands outside the walls. The upstairs archive holds the fair copies, but earlier in the life of the building, there were moments when the surest lock was simply mass. A bundle of parchments tied with twine and dusted with sand to set the ink could be tucked on a shelf. In a low, dry bay beneath a sacristy stair for a week until filing day. A sacristan would come and go with a lamp, counting chasubles for a feast, then, passing the shelf, touch the twine, not out of a bitter, little audit in the dark. Not all. Change came as paperwork and wax. Fire writes its own entry. When the roof burned in our century and the spire fell, the immediate questions concerned timber and lead and weatherproofing. But the work of scaffolding, the crossing, and replacing vault webs also brought archaeologists to the transept crossing, the heart of the plan, where they opened the floor to test soils and set supports under the flags. They found what such places often yield when a great church has layered itself for 8 centuries. Tombs cut into earlier fill, a leaden sarcophagus crafted for a dignitary, its anthropomorphic bulge preserving a high status. Burial, sculptural fragments from a medieval root screen dismantled long ago and reused as tidy stone fill. Nothing sensational, careful church had used its own past as ballast, but telling all the same. A single cut through a floor records centuries of adjustments. The eye above never sees. Such finds do not solve mysteries so much as thicken them. A lead coffin says, someone mattered here, enough to merit the expensive metal and the labor of shaping it. But labels rarely survive under stone. Was the man a canon who sang the office daily? A noble benefactor whose land rents paid for candles and repairs? An archdeacon whose disputes with the city left soot in the margins of the chapter minutes? The object tells you rank, craft, habit. The name it withholds. The root screen fragments say the 18th century preferred unimpeded sightlines. The 13th century framed its mysteries with carved stone. Phil says, what once told a story now bears weight. We imagine spectacular, secret rooms. And sometimes the imagination is rewarded with a blocked arch in a pocket of air. An abandoned stair that once let a verger slip behind an altar. A redundant passage bricked when a chapel's use changed. A cavity left when scaffolding holes were filled around a new pier. Much more often, the underfloor answers the question, what is hidden here? With the dignity of ordinary things. Candle wax shaved from the pavement and pushed by a knife into a gap. A rosary bead that rolled and never returned. A folded schedule for a procession, names of stations and hymn incipits that slipped from a pocket in the choir and drifted down a heating slit 2 centuries later. Archaeology loves such accident. Cathedrals are full of it. The island's river sense complicates everything. Seine sets and resets its boundary by damp and season on the Isle de la site. That tenderness makes discipline. The masons who cut the original footings, chose lime carefully, and packed joints tight. Later generations chased salts that bloomed as white fur along the underside of stones. Ventilation in the underfloor becomes not romance, but respiration. Air must be coaxed to move, so that the great polychrome which you admire in a chapel or the paint skin on a medieval column does not draw dampness up from below and crack a slot. Under a step is not a secret. It is a long talk long enough with a person who has kept a cathedral going. Any cathedral in mystery yields its place to method. Thursday is for scraping wax, and the wax that is saved pays for oil. Cracked. Flag goes into the ledger with a number and a sketch, so that when a donor inquires about repairs, you can show plainly what gift in stone will meet. When a burial cavity collapses, a finger's breadth at the corner of a pier, you lift the slab, repack lime rubble, set the flag again, leave no mark on the surface but a hair's breadth of new mortar in a joint. The point is not to conceal wonders. The point is to keep feet safe and services on time and memory in order. Yet the human desire for story does not surrender to procedure. Stand in a nave when it is quiet, really quiet. A winter morning, perhaps, you will feel how lightly the floor sits on the life it covers. Every step is a sentence written on a palimpsest. Beneath the flags, the ledger of interments and relocations, of seals broken and seals remade, of drains cleared and chutes relined, runs page after page. We know some lines, the names carved under worn brass letters, the dates when a sacristy was refitted, the year a stonecutter's note records a void behind a pier. We also do not know many lines, the small marks scratched by hands we cannot place, the reasons a passage was closed rather than maintained. The moments when the safest place for a thing, a text, a gift, a grief, was a lock of mass and a skin of mortar. The parvis itself remembers. It was leveled and re-leveled as Paris modernized, and in leveling, earlier frontages and drains were cut and mapped. That map laid out down the stairs in the archaeological crypts, the cathedral's mirror, a reminder that a building does not float above its city. It grows out of it and settles back into it. What the city decides to cover or display is not simply a scholarly matter. It is an ethic of attention. To give a glass walkway to a Roman wall is to say, you may not pass, yet please see. Too close, a blocked medieval cellar with a neat rectangle of concrete is to say, someone noted this, recorded it, and left it asleep. Okay. Both gestures are forms of care. If you ask, then, what was hidden beneath the floor of Notre Dame? The patient answer is, foundations, vaults, drains, bones, reused stones, fragments repurposed as fill, packets of the everyday that slipped down a crack and sat like seeds. And also, the less patient answer is always also there. A lead sarcophagus in a cut through the crossing, painted stone from a long-gone screen. The possibility that somewhere a small cavity holds something placed deliberately and then allowed to become part of the building's forgetfulness. The upper church teaches revelation, light, clarity, a sightline to the altar. The underchurch teaches retention, opacity, mass, the discipline of letting some things remain in shadow. You feel the urge to pry. The building councils are different. Posture, to look down as much as up. To listen for hollows with your feet. To grant the ordinary the respect it deserves for holding so much in place. Hey, if there is a secret underfoot, it is rarely a trapdoor to a treasure room. It is the humble continuity of unglamorous task-stamping lime, listing flags, airing a bay that keeps memory from crumbling. And yet, the unresolved thought persists, like a low note under the organ's first chord. With all this careful layering and tidy forgetting, what small, deliberate thing might still lie in a pocket of air beneath the nave placed there by hands that trusted the floor more than any lock? And how would we even know it if a loose stone one day revealed it? The world above the cathedral floor was vibrant, alive with the clang of hammers, the murmur of prayers, and the ceaseless shuffle of feet. Beneath Notre Dame, the silence pressed heavier. It was the silence of soil, stone, and centuries, stacked one upon another. And workers and clerics ventured down into those crypt-like corridors, those forgotten subfloors below the nave. They did so with lanterns that illuminated walls built long before the cathedral itself had risen from the banks of the Seine. What they saw was not always expected. Beneath the Gothic arches and brilliant stained glass of the great church stood remnants of an earlier Parisa Roman settlement. Lutetia, still present in its broken walls, its paved fragments, its faint outlines of a city long erased above ground. By the 12th century, when Notre Dame began its climb skyward, those remains had already been ancient, and yet, instead of sweeping them away, the masons and planners had chosen to build over them, sealing their past beneath their present. It was cheaper, perhaps, or practical, but it also meant that every step worshippers took in the cathedral echoed faintly over the stones of Rome. Imagine walking across the cathedral's grand floor during a feast day procession. Beneath your heels lay not only the packed dirt of medieval construction, but buried roads where Roman merchants once bartered and legionaries marched. Beneath the glow of the rose windows' glass were outlines of long-forgotten homes. Layers of history sat, stacked like strata, one civilization pressed against another. Whispers of the past muffled beneath weighty stone. This layering did not go unnoticed by the clergy. Chroniclers of the 13th century remarked that Notre Dame stood upon foundations older than the faith. It was both a source of pride and of unease. Pride, because it connected the church to Rome, the eternal city, and the empire that had carried Christianity from its infancy was unease because Rome had also been pagan, and the soil of Paris had once hosted altars not to Christ, but to Jupiter, Mercury, and Diana. What, then, truly lay beneath the cathedral? Was it sacred foundation, or the residue of idolatry? The question became more pressing as relics were brought to the cathedral and stored in its treasury. The most famous was, of course, the crown of thorns, purchased at immense cost by King Louis IX. But there were others, 2 splinters of the true cross, bones of saints, scraps of garments. These were paraded in grand processions through the nave and tucked safely into reliquaries. Yet, not all relics were kept above ground. Some were interred below, in chambers meant to secure them against theft or desecration. And so the lines between pagan ruins and Christian deposits blurred. The Roman stones were now joined by reliquaries sealed in niches, sacred bones lying a few feet from abandoned altars of gods. It is said that during one renovation in the 14th century, a mason claimed to have unearthed a set of carved stones far beneath the choir. They were inscribed not with Latin script, but with strange, looping symbols. The man brought one up to the surface, only to be ordered by a canon to return it to the soil and cover it again. The church, he was told, had no need of pagan fragments, stirring unrest. Whether this account was fact or embellishment, it spread, and with it, the idea that beneath Notre Dame was something more than Roman walls. It was a place where old mysteries lingered. Ordinary Parisians began to whisper about the sealed floor of the cathedral. They believed treasures lay hidden. They're not gold or jewels, but ancient writings, knowledge buried in stone. Others feared that what lay beneath was cursed, that the foundations were tainted by offerings once made to forgotten gods. In times of plague or famine, rumor always returned to what was hidden below. Had Paris been built upon a restless foundation? Did those stones beneath the altar demand something in return? By the 15th century, the cathedral's subfloor had gained a new role. It became a burial place, not for kings or noblemen that honor belonged to the Basilica of St. Denis, but for certain canons, bishops, and benefactors of the cathedral. Their coffins were interred beneath the floor in carefully walled chambers. Over time, dozens of skeletons accumulated in the silent dark, their presence mingling with the Roman stones and the hidden reliquaries. Bones of the medieval dead thus joined bones of antiquity, merging 2 worlds into one layer of soil. Centuries later, when archaeologists first pried open those floors, they would indeed find such burials, stacked in tight rows, forgotten save for the occasional faded inscription. But in the Middle Ages, the awareness of them was enough to deepen the cathedral's mystery. For each coffin sealed, each reliquary hidden, each pagan wall quietly left undisturbed, another layer of history pressed down into silence. In silence, has its own kind of presence. The cathedral itself seemed to acknowledge it. During Mass, the sound of chants rolled across the stone vaults and vibrated down through the pillars into the floor. The monks and priests did not think of it, but the vibrations traveled into the soil, into the chambers below, echoing faintly where bones rested. Sound became weight, prayer became resonance. It was as though the floor itself absorbed centuries of worship, pressing them like invisible inscriptions onto stone. The people of Paris were not blind to these things. They told stories of strange noises heard in the crypts, of footsteps that seemed to rise from beneath the nave when no one was there. One tale spoke of a sacristan who swore he heard the murmur of voices rising through the stones on the eve of Easter. When he pressed his ear to the floor, he claimed he heard Latin phrases, not of Mass, but of something older, echoing up from the buried ruins. The account was dismissed as invention, but it lingered in city gossip for years. Other stories connected the cathedral floor to the very heart of Paris. Some claimed that beneath Notre Dame lay a sealed vault where city officials stored documents. of great importance, a secret archive hidden away for safety. Others suggested it was where the church stored, not relics, but forbidden textbooks banned from circulation, locked away in darkness. There is no evidence for this, but the persistence of rumor shows how people understood the cathedral, not just as a house of worship, but as a vessel of secrets. The 16th and 17th centuries brought turmoil, religious wars, revolts, foreign occupation. Yet the floor of Notre Dame remained undisturbed, always there, always mute. Soldiers marched across it, mobs rioted through it. Revolutionaries later desecrated its altars, but still beneath the stones lay bones, relics, and ruins, sealed away from every upheaval above. Even as kings fell and regimes changed, the whispers beneath did not fade, and perhaps the most unsettling thought remained this: the builders of Notre Dame had known exactly what they were covering. They had seen the Roman ruins. They had walled in the chambers. They had sealed the bones and relics beneath. Yet they had chosen to close it, not display it. Why? Was it merely practical? A foundation choice? Or had they decided some things were better left unseen, better left sealed in silence beneath the floor of a cathedral? The answer was never written. No chronicle preserved the reasoning. No bishop's decree explained the decision. It was as though the builders themselves wanted to leave behind a question, a silence louder than any explanation. And that silence remains. For when you walk across the stones of Notre Dame, beneath your feet are not just foundations, but centuries of history hidden in darkness. Pagan walls, Christian reliquaries, coffins of forgotten clerics all pressed together beneath the weight of prayer and song. They are there, even if unseen. They are there, even if forgotten. And the question lingers, if so much has already been unearthed, how much more lies sealed still beneath layers that no one has touched? What if beneath the very heart of the cathedral there rests something not yet revealed, something waiting in the silence of stone? The cathedral endured through centuries of fire, revolution, and war. Notre Dame stood as if her very stones had learned patience from the long silence beneath. Yet always the question remained, what precisely lay hidden under those floors? The 18th century, Paris had grown around the cathedral like ivy, crowding her island with homes, shops, and taverns. Life bustled, but beneath the cathedral floor, nothing changed. The crypt-like corridors were seldom opened, and when they were, it was only by clerics, builders, or gravediggers performing small duties. To the ordinary citizen, the mysteries below seemed as remote as the stars above. Still, whispers persisted. Revolution brought new upheaval. When mobs entered the cathedral during the late 18th century, tearing down statues, smashing altars, even crowning the goddess of reason upon its stones, there was talk that they might unearth the floor, seeking treasure. Yet the rebels never dug. They desecrated the visible, but the invisible remained. Perhaps it was the sheer labor of stone, or perhaps some deeper unease restrained them. Even those bent on destroying the cathedral's sanctity paused before disturbing what was sealed below. In the 19th century, great restorer Eugene Viollet-le-Duc undertook his monumental work on Notre Dame. He rebuilt spires, repaired portals, renewed sculptures. Draftsmen and masons worked with meticulous care. And still, beneath the cathedral, the foundations and crypts lay undisturbed. Viollet-le-Duc, for all his interventions above ground, never tore open what was hidden below. He rebuilt the visible face of Notre Dame, but the cathedral's underworld remained cloaked in darkness, sealed from his touch. The ordinary people of Paris, however, remained fascinated by the idea of secrets underfoot. By then, Paris itself had grown accustomed to subterranean life. The city had quarries turned into catacombs, with tunnels stretching for miles, teed with bones stacked like books on shelves. To the imagination of the public, Notre Dame was simply another of these subterranean places' own hidden catacomb, though one reserved not for the common dead, but for ancient things. Things even older than Christianity in France. Romantics of the 19th century began weaving the cathedral's foundations into their poetry and prose. Victor Hugo, in his famous novel, never lingered on those lower levels, but the Gothic mood he created left ample room for readers to imagine them. They became part of the mental fabric of Paris, Notre Dame, as not just a building, but a layered mystery. Rising above ground, but rooted in something darker, older, stranger below. By the time the 20th century arrived, a slow curiosity began to build among scholars. Ecology had matured into a science. Across Europe, ancient remains were uncovered beneath churches, cloisters, and basilicas. Each dig revealed forgotten tombs, crypts, mosaics, and foundations that rewrote histories. Parisian historians began to wonder what might Notre Dame hide beneath their stones. Surely something more than bones. Surely something older. It was not until the mid-20th century, however, that systematic excavations were attempted. During work on the square in front of the cathedral, the Parvis, archaeologists stumbled upon Roman walls, medieval structures, and layers of history preserved in silence. They found traces of Lutetia, the Roman town, its streets and foundations pressed against the very roots of the cathedral. It was proof of what had always been whispered, that beneath Notre Dame lay not just relics of saints, but entire ages of forgotten Paris. Yet even those finds barely scratched the surface. The floors beneath the nave remained largely closed. Scholars documented what they could, but so much remained unreachable. Locked beneath massive slabs, sealed beneath centuries of worship and ritual. The cathedral kept her silence when, in 2019, flames swept through Notre Dame and the spire collapsed. There was a moment when all of Paris feared the cathedral's story had ended. But as restorers and engineers entered the ruins, they once more found themselves standing above that ancient floor. Beneath the devastation of fire, beneath the collapse of beams, the subfloor still endured, untouched. Bones, ruins, relics, they remained there, preserved in their long silence, as though indifferent to the passing of centuries and calamities above. And this, perhaps, is the enduring mystery, the knowledge that beneath one of the most famous cathedrals in the world lies a hidden archive of stone, bone, and silence, only partly uncovered. Even today, archaeologists debate how much remains sealed. How many reliquaries might still lie walled away? How many Roman altars remain sealed in dust? What inscriptions, long buried, might yet surface if the floor were pried open? To walk into Notre Dame, even now, is to feel this layering of time. The sun pierces through her rose windows, scattering colored light across the floor. Tourists shuffle across her nave, their cameras raised, their voices low in awe. Pilgrims kneel, whispering prayers as they have done for centuries. And yet, for every footstep above, for every candle lit, for every voice lowered in reverence, there remains a silence below, the silence of bones pressed into earth, the silence of relics sealed in stone, the silence of a pagan past folded beneath Christian ritual. It is a silence that speaks, not in words, but in weight. To stand in Notre Dame is to stand not only in the presence of her soaring arches, but also in the presence of everything buried beneath. You feel it in the coolness of the floor, in the way sound lingers as though absorbed by more than air. You feel it in the knowledge that the cathedral is not built upon blank earth, but upon centuries layered in secrecy. The whispers of Notre Dame, then, are not literal voices rising from beneath, but the felt presence of those who came before Romans, who paved streets, medieval canons who laid coffins, craftsmen who sealed reliquaries, revolutionaries who paused before disturbing the foundations. and archaeologists who brushed away dust only to glimpse fragments. Their hands, their lives, their traces remain pressed into the soil, waiting. And perhaps this is why Notre Dame has always felt alive, as if she breathes history as much as she embodies faith. Her walls are not only Gothic triumphs, vessels of memory. Her floors are not only stone slabs, they are lids upon buried time. So when one enters the cathedral, it is worth pausing, even briefly, to consider not only the glass above, but the silence below. For there, beneath your feet, lies a Paris unseen, a world forgotten, yet enduring. And in that silence lies the truest whisper of all, the reminder that every generation, no matter how loud, eventually becomes another layer in the soil, another voice sealed in stone, waiting to be remembered. The stones of Notre Dame endure, but beneath them, the whispers of centuries still linger.